The dim glow of streetlights flickered over the quiet streets of Panama City, Florida. It was the early hours of June 3rd, 1961, a warm and humid night like many others in the sleepy town. Yeah, the air was thick with the scent of salt from the Gulf of Mexico, mingling with the occasional breeze that rustled through the palm trees. Most of the town's residents were fast asleep, their homes filled with the rhythmic breathing of families lost in dreams. But on one street, a shadow moved with purpose. The Bay Harbor pool room, a small but popular billiards hall, stood in eerie silence. The neon sign that usually buzzed softly above the entrance was dark, its power cut for the night. Inside, rows of pool tables stood still, their green felt surfaces waiting for the first break of the morning games. The register sat locked behind the counter, its drawers filled with small bills and loose change from the day's earnings. Then a sudden crash. The sound of shattering glass pierced the silence. A figure emerged through a broken window, stepping carefully over the shards that littered the floor. His silhouette was barely visible in the darkness as he moved quickly, his breath controlled, his actions precise. He knew where to go. He reached for the cigarette vending machine, wrenching it open with a crowbar. Metal creaked, and cigarettes spilled onto the floor as he reached in, pulling out coins. The jukebox was next. Another hard blow sent a cascade of nickels and dimes scattering onto the floor. His hands moved fast, scooping up the coins and shoving them into his pockets. Finally, he made his way behind the counter. The register was the main prize. With one swift motion, he forced it open, the loud ka-chunk of the drawer releasing into the silence of the room. Inside, bills, coins, just enough to make it worth the risk. He took everything he could, stuffing it into his jacket before turning back toward the window. Then a noise, a footstep outside. The figure froze. For a moment, he held his breath, his ears straining to listen. Had someone seen him? Heard him? He peered toward the window, his heart pounding. A man was walking down the street, not toward the pool hall, just passing by. But then, the man slowed. His head turned slightly, his steps hesitant. The intruder didn't wait. He bolted, through the broken window, into the night, disappearing into the darkness just as the man on the street stopped and stared. His name was Henry Cook, and he had just seen a crime. Morning arrived in Panama City, Florida, with the golden sun casting long shadows across the quiet town. The humid air carried the scent of salt from the Gulf, blending with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon from local diners opening their doors for early customers. The small community awoke as it did every day, unaware that the events of the previous night would soon stir up a legal battle that would make history. At the Bay Harbor pool room, the scene of the crime was now under investigation. A police cruiser was parked outside, its flashing lights illuminating the broken window. Sheriff's deputies crouched, inspecting the shattered glass, cigarette packs scattered on the floor, and the open register with its contents emptied. Sheriff Harold Finch, a seasoned officer with years of experience in petty crime investigations, adjusted his belt and turned to the young patrolman beside him. "What do we have?" he asked, stepping carefully over the debris. "It looks like a break-in." "Sheriff," the deputy replied, flipping through his notepad. "Cigarette machine's been busted open. Jukebox too. Register's empty. Witness says he saw someone leaving the scene." Sheriff Finch raised an eyebrow. "A witness? Who?" A young man, Henry Cook, stood nearby, his arms crossed, shifting nervously as the officers turned toward him. "All right, Cook," the sheriff said, walking up to him. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Henry swallowed hard. He wasn't the type to get involved with the law, but what he had seen last night had been too suspicious to ignore. "I was walking home, Sheriff," he started. "It was late, real late. I passed by the pool hall, and I saw a man inside. He was moving fast, like he was up to no good, and then he ran." "You sure it was a man?" the sheriff asked. Henry nodded. "Positive. I didn't see his face real good, but I saw his shape, the way he moved. He had a bottle in his hand and his pockets looked stuffed, like he was carrying something heavy, money, I bet." Sheriff Finch narrowed his eyes. "You recognize him? Could you tell who he was?" Henry hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think it was Clarence Earl Gideon." The name made the sheriff sigh. Clarence Earl Gideon was well known around town, not for violence, but for being a drifter. He was a 51-year-old man, weathered from years of labor and misfortune. He had a record of small crimes, nothing violent, just the kind of trouble a man with little money and no luck seemed to fall into. "You sure about that?" "Cook?" The sheriff asked again. Henry nodded. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was him." That was enough for Sheriff Finch. All right, let's go pick him up. Clarence Earl Gideon was woken up by the sound of heavy fists pounding on his door. The small boarding house where he stayed was on the rougher side of town, filled with working men and drifters who rented rooms by the week. Gideon, who had spent most of his life moving from place to place, fit right in. When he opened the door, he found two deputies standing there, their expressions unreadable. "Clarence Earl Gideon?" one of them asked. Gideon squinted in the morning sun. He wasn't surprised to see them. Trouble had followed him his whole life, and he had learned to expect it. "Yeah, that's me." "You're under arrest." Gideon blinked. "For what?" "Breaking and entering. Bay Harbor pool room." Gideon frowned, his mind racing. He hadn't been there. He knew it, but he also knew how things worked for men like him. He had a record. He had no money, and worst of all, he had no lawyer. Still, he wasn't about to go quietly. "You got proof?" he asked, folding his arms. The deputy exchanged a glance with his partner. "We got a witness." Gideon scoffed. "A witness? Who?" "Henry Cook. Said he saw you running from the scene." Gideon let out a dry chuckle. "Well, I guess that settles it, don't it?" His voice was thick with sarcasm. "You can argue in court, Gideon. Let's go." Gideon sighed. He had no choice. With cuffs snapping around his wrists, he was led out of the boarding house, past the curious eyes of other tenants who peeked through their doors. As he was pushed into the back of the patrol car, he stared out at the town he had drifted through for years. He already knew what was coming, and he knew he was on his own. Clarence Earl Gideon sat in the cramped holding cell of the Bay County Courthouse, waiting for his turn before the judge. The air was thick with the stale scent of sweat and old paper, a smell that seemed to cling to the walls of every courtroom he had ever stepped into. He had been in trouble before, nothing serious, just small-time offenses, the kind that got him a night or two in jail, maybe a fine. But this time, it was different. They weren't letting him go this time. A 5-year sentence loomed over him like a dark cloud. Gideon adjusted his worn-out shirt, rubbing his calloused hands together. He had spent years working odd jobs, carpentry, labor, whatever paid. He was a drifter, sure, but not a criminal. He didn't break into the pool hall, and he sure as hell wasn't about to sit quietly while they railroaded him. A sharp clank from the iron door broke his thoughts. "Gideon, you're up," a deputy grunted, unlocking the door. Taking a deep breath, Gideon stepped into the courtroom. A one-sided battle. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches packed with spectators, locals who had heard about the case and came to see justice served. Some whispered as Gideon walked in, their eyes judging him before the trial even began. At the front, behind the massive judge's bench, sat Judge Robert McCrary Jr., a man who had seen thousands of cases like this one. His thick-rimmed glasses rested on the tip of his nose as he shuffled some papers, barely looking up. To Gideon's right stood the prosecutor, a clean-cut man in a neatly pressed suit, William Harris. Unlike Gideon, he had the law on his side. He had studied in law school, practiced for years, and had the power of the state behind him. Gideon, on the other hand, had nothing. No lawyer, no money, no one to defend him. He cleared his throat and raised his hand. "Your Honor, I would like a lawyer appointed to me." The courtroom went silent. Judge McCrary looked up, his expression indifferent. "Mr. Gideon, Florida law only provides an attorney for those facing the death penalty. Your charge does not qualify." Gideon felt his stomach tighten. "But Your Honor, I can't afford one. How am I supposed to defend myself against a trained prosecutor?" The judge sighed. "That is not the court's concern. The trial will proceed." Gideon clenched his fists. This wasn't right. He knew deep down that something about this was unfair. But he also knew one thing. No one in this room cared, except him. Gideon wasn't a lawyer, but he had been in enough courtrooms to know how things worked. He took a deep breath and stood before the jury, determined not to go down without a fight. The prosecutor, William Harris, began his opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. The Bay Harbor pool room was broken into. The register was emptied. A witness saw Clarence Earl Gideon leaving the scene. The facts speak for themselves. Gideon frowned. Facts? What facts? All they had was some guy who thought he saw him. When it was his turn, Gideon walked up slowly. The courtroom watched. Some of them expected him to beg for mercy, but he wasn't going to. Instead, he did the only thing he could do, fight back with common sense. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady but firm, I stand before you today without a lawyer, while the man accusing me has the full power of the state behind him. Ask yourselves, is that fair? Some of the jurors shifted in their seats. Gideon continued, now let's talk about this witness, Henry Cook. He says he saw me leaving the pool hall, but ask yourselves, how well could he really see in the dark? Did he see my face? Did he see me with money in my hands? Or is he just guessing? A murmur rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor objected, saying Gideon was arguing instead of providing evidence. The judge agreed, cutting him off. Gideon sat back down. He had done his best. Now, it was out of his hands. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, Gideon already knew what was coming. The foreman stood up. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at Gideon. Clarence Earl Gideon, I sentence you to 5 years in Florida State Prison. Gideon felt his knees go weak. 5 years? For a crime he didn't commit? The deputies grabbed him by the arms and led him away. The courtroom doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. But as they marched him toward his prison cell, one thought kept running through his mind. This isn't over. Clarence Earl Gideon sat on the thin, worn-out mattress of his prison cell in Rayford, Florida. The walls around him were cold, gray, and unyielding, just like the system that had placed him there. 5 years. That's what they had given him. 5 years for a crime he swore he didn't commit. A crime where the only evidence was the word of one man who wasn't even sure. A crime where he had been forced to fight alone in a courtroom that already decided his fate before he even spoke. The injustice gnawed at him. The Florida State Prison was filled with men who had given up, men who knew that once the law crushed them, there was no way out. But Gideon wasn't one of them. He had spent his whole life struggling, but this time he wasn't going to lie down and take it. The prison library became Gideon's escape. While others passed time in the yard, he buried himself in books about the law, flipping through pages with the kind of intensity he had never felt before. He started with the Constitution. He read about the Sixth Amendment, the one that guaranteed the right to a lawyer. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Gideon stared at those words. How could this be? How could they deny him a lawyer if the Constitution clearly said he had a right to one? Then he learned about precedents, previous cases where the Supreme Court had ruled on similar issues. He read about how certain rights applied to federal cases, but not always to state cases. That was the loophole Florida had used against him. But then Gideon stumbled across something even more important, a petition for writ of certiorari. It was a request that an inmate could send to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking them to hear their case. He realized something. He didn't need money. He didn't need a lawyer. He only needed paper, a pencil, and determination. And so, Gideon picked up his pencil and began to write. The letter wasn't fancy, just a simple handwritten appeal from a man who had nothing left to lose. He carefully worded it, explaining how his trial had been unfair, how he was denied an attorney, how Florida's system had left him defenseless, how it violated the Constitution. Page after page, he made his case. When he was done, he read it over twice. Then he addressed it to the United States Supreme Court, Washington, D.C. He had no lawyer, no legal team, but he had one thing no one could take away from him: hope. He handed the envelope to a prison guard. It was out of his hands now. Months passed. Gideon kept reading, kept waiting. Most prisoners never heard back. Most petitions ended up ignored, buried under piles of legal paperwork. But Clarence Earl Gideon was different. One day, in early 1963, something extraordinary happened. The Supreme Court of the United States accepted his case. 9 of the most powerful judges in the country were going to review the case of an unknown prisoner from Florida who had nothing but a pencil and his determination. It had never happened before. Gideon had done what no one thought possible. He had outsmarted the very system that tried to bury him. But Gideon wasn't a lawyer. He had no idea how to argue before the highest court in the nation. That's when Abe Fortas stepped in. Fortas was a brilliant Washington, D.C. attorney, handpicked by the Supreme Court to argue Gideon's case. He had defended powerful politicians and high-profile figures, but now he was taking on the fight of a lifetime for a poor man he had never met. When Fortas read Gideon's letter, he was stunned. "This man is right," he told his colleagues. Denying him a lawyer was unconstitutional. He began preparing for one of the most important cases in American history, Gideon versus Wainwright. Meanwhile, back in his prison cell, Clarence Earl Gideon waited. Would the Supreme Court hear his voice? Would they fix the injustice? Or would they ignore him, just like Florida had? The halls of the United States Supreme Court were nothing like the dusty courtroom where Clarence Earl Gideon had been sentenced. Here, the ceilings were high, the walls lined with marble, and the very air seemed to hum with power and history. It was a place where the most important legal decisions in the country were made, where the voices of the powerless could be heard, if only they knew how to reach it. And now, against all odds, Gideon's case had arrived. On January 15, 1963, the Supreme Court prepared to hear Gideon versus Wainwright, a case that would decide whether poor defendants had the right to an attorney, no matter where they were tried. For Florida, the case was simple. The law was the law. The state's representative, Bruce Jacob, stood confidently before the 9 justices, ready to argue that each state had the right to decide its own legal rules. For Gideon, his champion was Abe Fortas, one of the finest attorneys in the country. But Fortas wasn't just defending Gideon. He was defending every poor man and woman who had ever stood alone before the law. The courtroom was filled with reporters, lawyers, and legal scholars. The whole country was watching. Abe Fortas stepped forward and addressed the justices. "Your Honors," he began, his deep voice steady, "the question before you today is not just about Clarence Earl Gideon. It is about the very foundation of American justice." Justice Hugo Black leaned forward, listening intently. Fortas continued, "The 6th Amendment guarantees the right to counsel. Yet in Florida, that right was ignored. The result? A poor man, forced to defend himself against the full power of the state." The justices nodded slightly. Fortas then turned and pointed directly at Bruce Jacob, the Florida prosecutor. "Let me ask you this," he said, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "Would you be able to defend yourself in a trial without a lawyer?" Jacob hesitated. The room went silent. Then Fortas drove the point home. "If the answer is no, then how could Clarence Earl Gideon be expected to do so?" Justice Black finally spoke. "What are you asking this court to do, Mr. Fortas?" Fortas took a deep breath. "I'm asking this court to recognize that no man, rich or poor, should ever be forced to stand trial alone." The weight of his words settled over the room. Now it was Bruce Jacob's turn. He stood stiffly and adjusted his tie before speaking. "Your Honors," he said, "the state of Florida has its own legal system. The federal government should not interfere. The Supreme Court has already ruled in previous cases that the right to a lawyer does not extend to state trials unless capital punishment is involved." Justice Potter Stewart frowned. "But isn't it unfair to expect an uneducated man to understand the law?" Jacob tried to recover. "Your Honor, many defendants defend themselves just fine without a lawyer." Justice William O. Douglas raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Tell me, Mr. Jacob, how many defendants who represent themselves actually win their cases?" Jacob hesitated. He had no answer. And in that moment, he knew the justices were not convinced. For weeks, the Supreme Court justices debated behind closed doors. Some were cautious. This decision would change the entire legal system. But Justice Hugo Black, a firm believer in the rights of the accused, was determined. "Gentlemen," he said in their final meeting, "we have a duty to correct this injustice. The right to counsel is fundamental. Without it, justice is an illusion." One by one, the justices agreed. On March 18, 1963, the Supreme Court issued its decision. It was unanimous, 9-0. The ruling was clear. Every defendant, rich or poor, had the right to a lawyer. And just like that, Clarence Earl Gideon had won. When Gideon received the news in his prison cell, he smiled for the first time in months. But it wasn't over yet. He had won the battle, but not the war. Because of the Supreme Court's decision, Florida had to give him a new trial. This time, however, he would not be alone. The air in the Bay County Courthouse was thick with tension. Clarence Earl Gideon, now 53 years old, sat at the defendant's table once again. But this time, he wasn't alone. For the first time in his life, he had a real lawyer by his side. His new attorney, W. Fred Turner, was a seasoned defense lawyer. He had studied the case thoroughly, noting every flaw in the original trial. Unlike Gideon, he knew how to fight back. The state of Florida, however, was determined to convict Gideon again. They had already put him away once, and they were eager to do it again. But this time, things would be different. The prosecution, led by William Harris, was confident. After all, they had a witness, Henry Cook, the man who had testified against Gideon in the first trial. Harris stood up and began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are the same as before. A crime was committed at the Bay Harbor pool room. The register was emptied, and a witness saw Clarence Earl Gideon leaving the scene. It was the same argument they had made in the first trial. But what they didn't realize was that Turner was ready for them. When it was his turn, Turner stood and calmly addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this trial is not just about Clarence Earl Gideon. It is about whether the law treats all men fairly, rich or poor. Today, we will show that the first trial was unfair, and that the prosecution's case is built on nothing more than assumptions and weak evidence. For the first time, Gideon had someone speaking for him. And for the first time, the jury was listening. The prosecution called Henry Cook to the stand. Harris approached him and asked, "Mr. Cook, do you remember the night of the crime?" Cook nodded. "Yes, sir. I saw a man leaving the pool hall, carrying a bottle and with his pockets full." Harris smiled. He thought his case was solid. "And was that man Clarence Earl Gideon?" Cook hesitated, just for a second. I think so." Turner immediately stood up. "You think so?" he repeated. Cook shifted in his chair. Turner walked closer, his voice sharp and confident. "Tell me, Mr. Cook, was it dark that night?" Cook swallowed hard. "Yes." "How far away were you?" Maybe 40 feet? Turner raised an eyebrow. 40 feet away, at night? And you're sure it was Clarence Gideon?" Cook looked down. "Well, I was pretty sure," the jury murmured. Turner pressed on. "Did you see his face clearly?" Cook shook his head. "No, sir." Turner nodded. No further questions. The damage was done. The prosecution's star witness had just admitted that he never actually saw Gideon's face. But Turner wasn't done. He called his own witness, a man who had been staying at Gideon's boarding house the night of the crime. The man testified that Gideon had been at home sleeping at the time of the burglary. Turner turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man's testimony proves that Clarence Gideon could not have committed this crime. The state's case is based on guesswork and weak evidence. And in America, we do not send men to prison based on guesswork." The jury looked at one another. For the first time, they were thinking. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. When they returned, Gideon felt his heart pounding. The foreman stood up and cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." A hush fell over the courtroom. Then it exploded with whispers and gasps. Gideon sat completely still. He had spent 2 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And now, he was free. On August 6, 1963, Clarence Earl Gideon walked out of prison a free man, but his fight had done something far greater than securing his own freedom. Because of Gideon versus Wainwright, millions of poor defendants across the country were now guaranteed a lawyer. His name became part of history, proving that one man, armed with nothing but a pencil and determination, could change the law forever. As he left the courtroom, a reporter stopped him and asked, "Mr. Gideon, what will you do now?" Gideon smiled and replied, "Go home." And with that, he walked away, a free man, free